Nicole was going to be speaking on this topic, and her interest is mostly in the United States and even very locally to be concerned with relationship abuse here, even at Stanford, very locally. But she couldn't come. She's ill. And so I found out just a day or so ago that this was the case. So I am going to have you indulge me by listening to what I have to say about the issue, and I'm going to draw to quite an extent from my book, From Outrage to Courage, which is the text that I use for my class here at Stanford on international women's health and human rights. It's in a second edition, so anybody interested in it who's going to Amazon or something, be sure you get the second edition that was published in May of 2013. I am both happy and unhappy to talk about violence against women. I think, or gender-based violence. I think that it's at the center of everything we talk about with women's health. I just believe we can't have a conversation, we can't have a lecture, we can't have a conference on women's health without taking up the issue of violence against women. It is the strategy of people in power to maintain their power or to move up in a hierarchy. And this happens at every level, in a home where someone is attempting to maintain his power often. Most domestic violence is perpetrated by men against women. However, women in same-sex relationships, violence occurs at about the same level as in heterosexual relationships. But this is an attempt by a person in power to maintain power. And so it really stems from the kind of paradigm in which we live, where we are very happy to have a diverse community of males, females, people from all over the place. But as we start putting values on one side of these dichotomies, we get ourselves into trouble. So we know that we're very diverse, but when we start thinking in terms of rich being more important than poor, literate being more important than illiterate, white being more important than black, or vice versa, depending on where one lives, male being more important than female, rich being more important than poor. When we start doing that, we have created hierarchies in our system, and we live in these hierarchies entirely. I mean, almost every institution that we're concerned with is a hierarchy of some sort. And people are often attempting to maintain their position or climb to the top, and violence is often used. Whether at an international level, a country gets out of hand and we bomb it, or a child gets out of hand and the child is smacked. So violence is a strategy that's used for maintaining power. I'd like to just make a few general comments about violence against women and try to present some concepts of the prevalence of violence against women. And I'm going to draw from my book, and excuse me for reading a little bit here. It's been experienced for centuries, absolutely centuries. And in my book, I quote from a poem written by Sumangala's mother in India, translated from the Pali in the 13th century. She was a poet. It's interesting to me that we don't know her name. We only know that she was someone's mother. And she wrote this: "A free woman, at last free, free from slavery in the kitchen, where I walked back and forth, stained and squalid among cooking pots. My brutal husband ranked me lower than the shade he sat in. Purged of anger and the body's hunger, I live in meditation, in my own shade from a broad tree. I am at ease." This was Sumangali's mother in India, in Pali language in the 13th century. The first ever global study on domestic violence was released in November of 2005 by the World Health Organization. That is how recent it has been that we've considered violence against women, domestic violence specifically, to be a topic of study at the United Nations level. Anyway, it was done by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine with the World Health Organization. And the report showed that violence against women is widespread, we know that, with far-reaching health consequences. The report includes data from more than 24,000 women interviewed in 10 countries, many groups within those countries. Brazil, Ethiopia, Japan, Peru, Namibia, Samoa, Serbia, and Montenegro, Thailand, and Tanzania were the countries that were studied. And what that study found corroborated what had been found by many studies done primarily in the United States and Europe, studies that were based primarily on police reports and hospital admissions. The Center for Gender Equity describes violence against women as the most pervasive yet least recognized human rights abuse in the world, as well as, quote, a profound health problem, sapping women's energy, compromising their physical health, and eroding their self-esteem. It occurs in all countries, according to the Center for Gender Equity. Although women can also be violent and abuse exists in same-sex relationships at about the same level, the majority of partner abuse is perpetrated by men against women. Women are shoved, slapped, punched, beaten, burned, kicked, killed every day in every country around the world. This is a quote. About 1/3 of women around the world will have suffered violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. 1 in 3 women. 1 in 5 will experience rape or attempted rape in their lifetimes, with at least half of all sexual assaults occurring before a woman is 18 years old. If domestic abuse, dowry death, and other forms of violence, honor killing, and so on, if these were infectious diseases, we would absolutely declare an epidemic. I mean, there's no question that this could be considered an epidemic if we were talking about infectious disease. So the way we use words with this is important, and what we call this abuse, I think, is important. A lot of people refer to abuse or domestic abuse against women, and I find that an unacceptable term. I try not to use it. Domestic abuse is really a soft euphemism, I think, for what in fact is going on. Some people have suggested violence, some people have suggested domestic terror. And our slides take up this question of language, and Nicole talks about this quite often when she speaks. Let me hope that I do the right thing here. There should be something down here. Okay, many of you may have seen there's an interesting TED Talk by a guy named Jackson Katz, who talks about how we talk about domestic violence. Usually we talk about women being beaten by men. So Mary was beaten by John. In fact, John beat Mary. Mary was beaten by John. Mary was beaten. Mary is a battered woman. Our lens of focus shifts to Mary. The solution becomes attached to Mary. John is no longer present. And for a long time, until people, and many people now, are quoting this and using this, we need to change our language to describe what's going on. Because, for many reasons, there are 2 people involved, and we have not, until recently, thought that we could work with men to actually solve the problem of domestic violence. The focus, to a tremendous extent, and in my book, I give many examples of organizations working on the topic. Almost all of them are women's organizations working with women. So I am as guilty as anybody in focusing on that side of things. So I think it's a powerful thought. Jackson Katz, this woman came up with this sort of formulation, but Jackson Katz uses it in a very impressive TED Talk that he does. Let me go on and talk about, I think the next thing takes us on language too. Do I go like that? Yes. Don't tell women what not to wear. Tell women not to rape. Tell men not to rape. And that's very interesting because it's rather personal with me. I was in San Francisco one day at a fair or something, and out near the bay, and I was quite harassed. I was planning to meet a friend of mine, a man, to go and have dinner or something. And I was being harassed by this person who was kind of following me around and harassing me. And finally, my date arrived, and we went to dinner. I said, you know, I had this guy who was harassing me. He said, well, yeah, look what you're wearing. And I was wearing a sundress. You know, I had a sundress on, and that's what I was wearing. And I thought to myself, at that time, because I'm in a different generation from a lot of you people, I thought to myself, oh, yeah, you know, I kind of bought in to the idea that I had invited this harassment because of what I'd worn. So don't tell women what not to wear or what not to wear. Tell men not to rape. Some boys, yeah, there was a case in Southern California of boys, schoolboys raping girls, and it was unbelievable, the news about that. Parents of these boys were quoted as boys will be boys, you know, oh, boys will be boys. The boys this was a case, and here's some of the media. Excuses were made, laments the fact that their careers might be affected and so on, and stresses that the victim was drunk. Another aspect of language that I've found interesting, thinking of the international aspects of this, is the move away, not away from, but to include the human rights approach as we're talking about things. And this morning, Ruth Levine did this. She emphasized human rights as well as health issues. And I think to a great extent we've looked at health issues. Now that we're seeing that an issue like violence against women can be considered a human rights issue, it's useful in some ways, although a lot of people aren't that interested in human rights and maybe more interested in health, but it's useful, I think, to elevate it to that level of thinking of it in terms of human rights, abrogation of human rights, as opposed, or not as opposed to, but including a health issue, because it takes it away again from the individual woman's body, you might say. This is a crime against humanity. And so I think language is important, and we need to be careful about how we describe these things. This is just another slide that shows the number of rapes reported. Number of rapes that have happened. How we estimate that remains to be seen from hospital admissions and police reports. This refers to the U.S. Reported, you can see that corner. Face trial, you can see how many. And indicted, the little tiny corner. So at the moment, people, we're giving far more publicity and attention to this topic. It seems to be coming out of the closet to some degree, but we still have shame and stigma attached to the problem of domestic violence. I'm going to ask Violetta to come up because I'm taking too much of her time and I want you to have time. But I will say that that question of stigma is an important one. I have some figures here about how few women report violence and how many, the statistic is 92% in a study, want their health provider to ask. And now, increasingly, there are programs working with legal systems and working with doctors, working with lawyers, working with doctors and nurses and health professionals to add to the usual review of a visit to the doctor. You know, do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you feel safe at home? That question. I don't know how many of you have had that asked, but it was interesting. Not too long ago, a couple of years ago, I fell down and I ended up in hospital with some bruises. And they waited. I know the doctor was there, the nurses were there. And then one evening, the nurse came in to my room and said, oh, I wanted to ask you some questions. And she said, you know, are you all right? Do you feel safe at home? I said, I understand the question. I fell down. I fell over a step. But thanks for asking that question. That at last health officials are hearing what women wanted to hear, and that is, will someone ask me about it? They feel nervous and frightened to talk about it. Well, there's much more to say about what I think is really an incredibly important issue, but I'll stop there, and Violetta is going to talk about economic empowerment, economic questions, women's escape from poverty, again, a worldwide problem. And then we hope we'll have about 10 minutes for questions.